We'll draw the diagram showing the posteromedial surface. This is the posteromedial surface. The posteromedial surface is presenting itself towards the mastoid process. Mastoid process. So the bony element which comes in direct contact with the posteromedial surface is the mastoid process. Mastoid process, and there is an internal mastoid process along with another structure comes in direct contact with the posteromedial surface is styloid process. Styloid process with the muscle attaching to it, styloglossus, stylopharyngeus, muscles attaching to it, stylohyoid, styloglossus, stylopharyngeus, stylohyoid, styloglossus, stylopharyngeus muscles which are attaching to the styloid process. And this styloid process and mastoid process, styloid process, styloid process and mastoid process, these are the bony elements comes in direct contact with the posteromedial surface of the gland. Here this is the anteromedial surface and this is superficial surface. So the posteromedial surface comes in direct contact with the two bony elements, that is mastoid process and the styloid process with its muscle. Towards the here is the sternocleidomastoid muscle is there with the mastoid process. The muscle inserting to the mastoid process is a sternocleidomastoid, so that is also can be seen in relation with it. And the styloid process with its muscle styloglossus, stylopharyngeus and stylohyoid muscles. And there are some structures which are get separated from the parotid gland by means of the styloid process and its structures nearly to it. So first is internal jugular vein, internal carotid artery, then four nerves 9, 10, 11, 12. It's just a schematic representation. 9 glossopharyngeal, 10 vagus, 11 spinal accessory and 12 hypoglossal. These four nerves get separated from the posteromedial surface by means of styloid process. And there are some structures entering into the parotid gland through the posteromedial surface. They are the external carotid artery. External carotid artery emerges through the posteromedial surface, and like that the facial nerve enters into the gland through the external carotid artery and facial nerve. These are the two structures enters into the gland through the posteromedial surface. So these are the relations which can be seen at the posteromedial surface of the gland. The facial nerve, it enters into the gland through its upper part. The external carotid artery enters into the gland through the lower part. Next is another important portion, or that is the structures present or structures emerging through the borders of parotid gland. The structures emerging through the borders of parotid gland. So we can see the structures emerging from the parotid gland. For this purpose, we have to draw the diagram showing the parotid gland. First, we have already studied at the base there is superficial temporal vein, superficial temporal artery, auriculotemporal nerve. Auriculotemporal nerve is the branch of mandibular nerve which is emerging within the infratemporal fossa. Infratemporal fossa is a space which can be seen inside the cheek or behind the maxilla. So, just below the temple region. So, the auricular temporal nerve is majorly supplying the external aspect of the temple region, ear, external supply of the posterior part of the scalp, all these things by means of the auricular temporal nerve. So, it is a very thin nerve. So, these are the structures forming at the superior aspect or the superior border or through the base. The superficial temporal artery and vein, auriculo-temporal nerve. There are some structures which are emerges from the posterior aspect, that is same like that. There is a posterior auricular artery, posterior auricular vein and posterior auricular nerve. Posterior auricular artery is the branch of external carotid artery. Posterior auricular vein is the vein which drains from the posterior aspect of the ear, and it is draining posterior aspect of the scalp, and it is draining into the retromandibular vein, posterior division of retromandibular vein. So, that there is the posterior division of, there is the posterior auricular vein and there is a posterior auricular nerve. The posterior auricular nerve is the branch of facial nerve which is traversing within the gland. So, these are the structures named as posterior auricular nerves and vessels. There is artery and vein can be seen here. Now, through the anterior border, there are some structures emerging. They are the branches of the facial nerve from above downward. They are the temporal branch of facial nerve, zygomatic branch of facial nerve, transverse cutaneous artery with transverse cutaneous vein, upper buccal branch of facial nerve, lower buccal branch of facial nerve, marginal mandibular branch of facial nerve. These are the structures emerges from the anterior aspect. And of course, there is parotid duct also emerges from the anterior border. So, the structures emerges from the anterior border are marginal, one of the terminal branch. There are 5 terminal branches, out of which 4th one is the marginal mandibular nerve. There is lower buccal nerve, there is parotid gland, transverse facial vessels. We have studied all about the transverse facial vessels. Then zygomatic branch of facial nerve, temporal branch of facial nerve. Temporal branch of facial nerve. Here is the upper buccal branch of facial nerve. Upper buccal branch. So, from above downwards in an order, the structures emerging are temporal branch of facial nerve, zygomatic branch of facial nerve, transverse facial vessels, upper buccal branch of facial nerve, parotid gland, it is not parotid gland, it is parotid duct. parotid duct, lower buccal branch of facial nerve and marginal mandibular branch of facial nerve. These are the structures emerging from the anterior border. This is anterior border, this is posterior border, this is superior border or superior surface or the base. And again through the apex, the structures emerging are anterior and posterior divisions of retromandibular vein and the last branch, cervical branch of facial nerve. Retromandibular vein. So, these are the structures emerges from the parotid gland. Again, superficial temporal artery and vein with auricular temporal nerve. Anteriorly, the temporal branch of facial nerve, zygomatic branch of facial nerve, the transverse facial vessels, upper buccal branch of facial nerve, parotid duct, lower buccal branch of facial nerve, marginal mandibular branch of facial nerve, cervical branch of facial nerve, and retromandibular vein. They are emerges through the apex, and posteriorly through the posterior border there is posterior auricular nerves and vessels emerging.